right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 145 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I say morning because I am on the West Coast. It's about 9 a.m. I think it's like 6 p.m. where Ian is in Moscow suburb.
7 p.m., but yes.
I always get it wrong. So 7 p.m. My co-host Ian Kummer has joined us, and we have two special guests. First special guest, Greg Rosen from Chicago. I believe it's is it 11 a.m. 11 a.m. Chicago time, and then Indi, our special guest, first time special guest from Sri Lanka. Thank you so much for joining us. I think it's 9. Is it 9:30? This is weird. Is it 9:30 there?
Yeah, it's 9:30. We're Indian Standard, which is a weird half hour that makes it impossible to calculate.
Yeah, I've never even heard of such a thing. I just assumed it was hour increments all the way around the planet.
I think there's two places. I think there's at least two places. There's here and some other random place.
No, that does make it it's a little weird. It makes it difficult to coordinate. But no, thank you for joining us. And then I had basically asked you to be a guest. I'm a regular reader of your work and your materials. I know friend of the show, the editor at the Greenville Post, and his name is escaping me. Oh my God. He posts a lot of your work and I read it there, but you have your own website, which I have linked to in the description below our YouTube video here. I think like we're on the same page. We have a little bit of ideological differences here on the program. I don't want to single out Ian, but Ian does not embrace the communist label yet. We're working on him. But yeah, I mean, like when we read your work, we're just like, yeah, that's absolutely 1,000,000,000% correct. And I did want to pick a particular article that I enjoyed and kind of discussing it. And it wasn't too long ago. I think it was from May 3rd, and I did link to it in the description here. But it was entitled something like "The Contradictions of National Capitalism," and I like how you describe national capitalism, and you shorten it to just Nacism. Or
yeah, you can help me how to pronounce that. Either Nacism or Nacism. I don't know what it is yet.
And it's pretty close to Nazism, which actually is correct. It makes a lot of sense because it's really not that indistinguishable as we are seeing today. But I do want to let you talk some, but I don't want to put you on the spot either. So you brought up two main contradictions in the article, and as I was waiting for everyone to join me, I had written down one of the main ideological contradictions that you address, and it's basically I put it in my own words. So, and I said planning is bad, but we must plan in order to defeat those evil folks that claim planning is good. And so this is kind of the capitalist ideology. We oppose planning. Any kind of planning is just bad. But there's these evil people who want to plan, and they want to, they want to organize things in a way that benefits people. And everybody knows that when you do that, it ends up in starvation and gulags and death camps. And so, but to defeat these people, we're going to have to plan a little bit. It's just, it's a contradiction. It's a what's the word? It's a real big contradiction, right?
Yeah. I mean, in order to if you look at China, when they came up, they made an effort to learn from capitalism. But within what I call national capitalism, there isn't that ability because the system has to say that it is the best system. Or as Churchill said, it's the least worst system. So if you're the best, then how can you learn from anyone else? And if you are going to learn from someone else, God forbid, you definitely can't learn from the communists because your whole system is built on them being the worst. So it's in this sort of impossible contradiction where it can't, as Sun Tzu said, you need to know yourself and know your enemy. And national capitalism can do neither. It has to both say that it's the best and someone else is the worst. So it just sort of lumbers on. I mean, you can see Trump, he's trying to like do something. He's trying to do national policies, but they're very brute force, and he can't get down through the bureaucracy, because even the idea of having a bureaucracy is like basically illegal in America. Like since Reagan, there's been the idea that government programs are communism and you should cut them and eliminate them and give everything out to the private sector. But then the private sector just pays itself and doesn't actually do anything. So they're in a bit of a conundrum.
Well, Fukuyama alleged, as you point out in your article, that there are no contradictions, that liberal democracy is the perfect system and it cannot be improved upon, and there are no contradictions that what did he say? No contradictions that other systems could deal with better, maybe he said. Something like that.
Yeah, what did he say? He said, in other words, any fundamental contradictions in human life that cannot be resolved in the... Oh, he was asking a question. He said, are there, in other words, any fundamental contradictions in human life that cannot be resolved in the context of modern liberalism that would be resolvable by an alternate political economic structure? So I think the idea is that within liberalism, you would have debate, and then you would have free markets, and then these would sort of like magically solve all problems without the need for any central planning or really any sort of ideological core.
Yeah. And like you point out, like, I mean, that it just is preposterous on its face. Way back then.
What's the saying? They're saying like not planning is planning to fail. Like there's always going to be some plan. It's just whether you're talking about it or not. And if you look at capitalism now, there's someone who wrote about this in the Brooklyn Rail. He said it's basically, I call it national capitalism because it's basically become nationalized. The government is a big player in every market now. So the government has to intervene in 2008 and then constantly since to sort of keep capitalism going. It's directly intervening. But it's this weird situation where sort of, I mean, they say run government like a business, but in what business would you buy out, say, the car companies or the banks and not take equity? But it's that sort of business where you just have this sucker. It's almost like a parent situation. But the government sort of nationalizes things, but I call it ass backwards American fashion, where the government effectively nationalizes companies, but then the effect is that the companies take over the government. It's ass backwards.
No, that's exactly what happens. And so, I mean, we always talk a lot. So our program is called Exposing Imperial Decline because, we're just watching every week, how the Western imperial system is declining. And really what they're doing is, they're trying to figure out a way to stop their decline. And as they do that, they expose themselves like never before. And they engage in all of these contradictory things, which, before now, they would always say, it's like it goes against all their ideology that they claim to uphold. So, free markets. And now, of course, we're engaged in all these tariffs. We're for human rights, but now we're, actually, out in the open conducting this genocide. So as Western imperialism is more and more under threat, they become more and more driven to do something to stop that decline from happening. And while they're doing that, they really expose the ideas of liberalism as just like kind of a facade.
Well, I mean, I have a question about that.
Yes.
We take it as an assumption that they're trying to stop the decline.
Okay.
Do you think, based on their behavior, that they're actually doing that? Or are they just trying to... The way I see it is maybe they... Like, if you think of an organism, right? Maybe they can only think a quarter ahead. So they're just thinking about how can I make money this quarter and not... Like, there's no concept of 5-year planning or, 10-year whatever planning. There's no concept of that. And if you think of it just a quarter ahead, what they're doing kind of makes sense, right? Like I have this leftover weapons stock, these HIMARS and artillery that's running out. Might as well go dump it in Ukraine, even if I lose that war. Or if I have these 2,000-pound bombs, I don't know, I need to get rid of them. Might as well go drop them on Gaza. It moves your money in the next quarter. And they're entirely rational decisions in that sense. you could say, oh, it makes the whole thing explode in 5-10 years. But I mean, that's kind of the private equity model, right? If you look at the private equity guys who run this, that's how they run businesses like Toys R Us or anything they take over. Actually, the model I use is Goodfellas or The Sopranos, like a bust out. So when the mafia takes over a business, they run it rationally for their purposes, which is just to get as much money out of it as possible and then light a match and collect the insurance money. And I think that may be what the elites are trying to do. I think that's, if you look at the private equity guys, that's all they know how to do. These guys don't know how to run normal businesses. They just know how to bust stuff out, like Tony Soprano or Henry Hill. And in that case, I mean, what do they care about decline, right? There's something, you can just bet against it and make more money on the way down.
So, no, I think that is definitely a correct perspective, but I think there is also an aspect of planning that is going on, right? And what I'm talking about is, I mean, it's been a decades-long effort to figure out how are we going to contain and deal with and weaken China. So that has been a more than a quarter planning. So, for instance, they have been, ringing China with military bases. They have retooled the Marine Corps away from armor and into a missile force, and they have put them all throughout the South China Sea to interdict these shipping lanes. And so they're preparing. They are preparing to deal with the existential threat of China. It could be, that they're really not that serious about doing it, that they think they're going to make money off of the efforts that they're going to, and they might understand, like I think how we understand, that there's no way they're actually going to contain China. They're just going to go through the motions and try and profit, while they're doing it. That could be totally true. But I definitely would like to invite Greg or Ian, because we've been monopolized. We've been monopolized.
Well, I do have a question. So it sounds like Indi, and I guess correct me if I'm misunderstanding the point. So there's this perceived decline in the American-led order. Now, would you say this is the system it's based on failing? Like there's an expiration date that a capitalist system can work in a country and a series of connected countries before it collapses? Or is it just those countries declining for related reasons? Because there are countries that are capitalist but are not collapsing. It is true that countries connected to the USA to a large degree are harmed when the USA declines, like the 2008 global recession, which is called a global recession, but really wasn't a global recession. It hurt the countries that were tied to it. So if you look at China or Russia or other countries that weren't attached to the USA at the hip, did not have serious market problems. So am I understanding that correctly? I mean, I guess it's an either or. Yeah, if you understand what I'm saying. So
I'm not an expert on Marxism, but within Marxism, there's the idea of sort of like historical progression. So capitalism is, if you read Marx, it's mostly talking about capitalism. It's actually a pretty good guide for finance if you just ignore all the moral parts. But there's this idea of like historical progression. So there's the idea that capitalism proceeds through to socialism, which proceeds to capitalism. And I think you can almost observe that happening. Even within mainstream economics, I've taken like economics 101, but the rate of profit is sort of supposed to decline with competition till you get to the point where everybody's operating on like just a margin level. And at that point, it almost makes sense to nationalize the companies. Capitalism should almost naturally lead towards socialism, because if there's as the rate of profit declines, it doesn't make sense for private enterprise to be running that. And I think you almost saw that in the 2008 crisis where, it would make sense to nationalize the car companies because they're not able to operate on their own. It would make sense to nationalize the banks because they're not able to function on their own. And I think the morbid symptoms you get are like, I think it's like someone who's 60 or 70 who's just trying to get Botox or plastic surgery or whatever to go back to when they were 20, and they just start to look worse and worse, right? Like, I think if capitalism would let itself evolve, if it even had the ideological possibility of historical progression, if it didn't think that like national capitalism was the best system ever and the end of history, then it might be able to change without dying. But I think it's like, someone trying to act and look like they're 20 years old for the rest of their life. It just looks fake and weird, and you cause yourself more damage in the long run. But I mean, in that piece I was talking about, those are sort of like the ideological differences. I'm not saying communism is the only system out there, but within communism, there is the idea of historical progression. There's the idea of change. Whereas within capitalism, there's the idea that this is the end. This is the best system. We just need to bomb the few people that hold out. And then, I mean, Fukuyama's thing, I like Fukuyama because he says just what people are actually thinking out loud. But he says that the problem at the end of history would be boredom because we've satisfied all material needs and everything is great. But obviously capitalism, even within capitalist texts, there is the idea that the rate of profit should decline. So like, then what happens? If you try and keep going, you end up with the government sort of artificially propping up profits, or even just printing money to like give people profits.
Well, the Japan economy with companies on life support chronically.
And then Japan got like Tonya Harding by America as well.
Well, there's this whole, there's the whole Keynesian economics leaving the gold standard and just going all in on fiat currency, which pretty much everybody was doing by World War II, and then by the Vietnam era. I think there was no gold standard at all periods. Like Nixon took the USA completely off the gold standards.
And you could argue that was a default. You could argue that they defaulted in the
70s.
Yeah,
because the Vietnam War was a major stressor in both the economy and in national expenditure. So you could say it's a default, or creative accounting to avoid a default, however you want to characterize it. What would you say, Indi, is the difference between what the USA is doing and a healthy planned economy, or even not necessarily even a planned economy, but just when it has a healthy amount of nationalization?
I mean, I don't know if the question is even nationalization, right? Like let's take Sri Lanka. If we wanted to invade the Maldives, it would cost money and we would bankrupt ourselves. But the US has been in a position where they could do all of this crazy stuff without just the normal consequences of any other country. And I think if you don't, so like people, like human beings, where they don't sense pain, you would think that might be a good thing. But those people, they don't feel it when they run into stuff. Their limbs fall off and they eventually actually die quite young. I think because of America's position, which it kind of lucked into post-World War II, where it could just make up money, it didn't have the natural consequences of its behavior. Like a war like Vietnam should have stopped wars. They should have been like this, we're broke, we can't afford this anymore. Yet somehow they could afford war after war after war. So whether they nationalize stuff internally or not, they've just been in this no consequence zone where you can do that for a while, right? Like in life, you can run up your credit cards, you can, hit people, you can steal, you can cheat. But the lesson even my kids learn from their kids' stories, that eventually, in the long run, consequences catch up to you. And I think that's what's happening to America. Like whether they nationalize stuff or not, they've just been in this free money, free war, I mean, everything except free love zone. And they've just been kicking the can down the road. And now I think it's finally exploded.
Did he answer your question, Ian? Do you want to follow up? Because I had something
No, I didn't
to say.
answer.
Well, I'll just say it's true. The USA is just a lot richer than everyone else. So there's, I wouldn't necessarily say it's consequence free, but I guess it's the difference between maybe a rich man and a poor man at the casino. You get more in the stock market.
I don't think the U.S. is richer, man. I don't think the U.S. is richer. Like I left the U.S. like 20 years ago, and I've been back since. And like people in the U.S. don't live that well, man. Like your average American has like less net worth than a Sri Lankan just because of the housing loans and mortgages and car payments, and like the average American has negative net worth. I think maybe once America was rich, but it's been kind of running up the credit card. Now it's actually pretty negative.
Yes, very little of it trickles down to the individual person. That's true. And I do think it's true, even with how little of it trickles down, I would say it was enough of a lifestyle difference for the average person, though that started. I don't know if there's an exact date that started changing, but I do think that's true what you said, because you said you'd been here 20 years ago, then you came. When did you come back? Out of curiosity,
I came back like a few years ago for like a wedding. I just remember like we got picked up in an Uber, and like the guy had a nice truck, and I was like, oh, how much is this truck? And it's like a $75,000 truck. So when I left America, like that's kind of what houses cost, like $75,000 to $100,000. And it's like, okay, so on paper, these people have lots of money, but then you look at how people live, and no offense, but people live like shit. Like they don't eat like very good. Like the housing is like cheap. You can like punch through the walls. It's, I don't know. Like it doesn't.
I think even if you look at municipal, I know Billy Bobby had something to say, so I won't go too up. So I think even if you look at municipal services, just what is the tax money at the municipal level being spent on, I think it is true. American cities, American suburbs probably look better than most of the rest of the world as far as streets being maintained, streets being kept clean. But even that's really increasingly becoming not true.
I mean, you compare it to like I see it flying in. I can't travel to America anymore, but like now India's pretty much a failed state, but Indian airports are kind of like better than American airports, and then China is actually in another world. It's other people have kind of invested in themselves a bit more, and I think a lot of the American gains of the last, let's say, 2 generations have been paper gains, which is like maybe sitting in some bank somewhere and just widening inequality. But it definitely hasn't gone into public services. It definitely hasn't gone to schools. It definitely hasn't gone into like roads, infrastructure. There's this guy, he does this website called Strong Towns, and he calculates essentially the liabilities of all the American infrastructure. So if you build a highway 30 years ago, cool, you have to like maintain it. And he's calculated that, and he calls the whole thing a Ponzi. He says they're paying old maintenance with new projects coming in, but there actually isn't enough tax revenue at the municipal level or at the local state government level. There actually isn't enough revenue coming in to even maintain the old stuff. It's just a big old Ponzi.
It's true that standards of living are decreasing. I think actual life expectancy has gone down some years, and that wasn't even including the COVID years that we had seen a drop in life expectancy in the United States. And Cuba has a higher life expectancy than us. But I was just going to, as Indi was explaining, his take on things, I was reminded of, why we're not improving, right? Why our country is incapable of improvement. And I think, my way of understanding that is that, this system could not be better for the wealthy people. Like this is the best system if you have money, because you can pay for the best schools, the best doctors, you have the best of everything. And so they don't really want to engage in a system that puts that at risk. And so democracy is a threat, they're threatened by it. And that's why they utilize the propaganda apparatus to convince everyone that this is the best system, right? No, this is the best. And for them, it is, and they're not lying. When they go on TV and tell you that this is the best system, they believe it because for them it is. But so this is the kind of the paradigm that's played out through history. And I always liken it to the kulaks in in Ukraine, because they really appreciated the way the agricultural system was set up. They had control of the agricultural system. They benefited from that system. When there was a famine, they got rich. The price of their commodities went up, and they had no interest in ceding power to the government, because the government wants to end famines. No, they were going to fight and die before they allowed that system to improve, so where famines would no longer be a problem. Famine was no problem to them. So this is okay. Well, hold on.
Go ahead.
Let me just finish. So it's just this paradigm, right, where you have a small group of elites that benefit from a dysfunctional system, and they are going to fight like hell and use all the resources at their disposal to maintain that system and to make sure it does not give way to a better system that is going to benefit the rest of the people, because for them, it'll get worse. So that's just the paradigm that we've seen throughout history play out with all the revolutions from, feudalism gave way to capitalism, liberalism, and now liberalism is giving way to socialism. But the capitalists who benefit from this, this liberal bullshit, are going to be resisting it, and that's kind of just what we see happening. So that's one way of that's how I like to that's how I see things. Ian, you had some objections, please.
Well, I don't know if there's an objection, maybe a caveat. So, like with the kulaks, it wasn't just Ukraine, by the way. It was in Russia and Belarus. Those and they weren't even interesting. They weren't even aristocracy, or there wasn't a bloodline. They were just rich or affluent peasants. So it's true, there was corruption and there was backstabbing. There was jealousy. Like, I don't like my neighbor because he has a cow and I don't. So I'm going to tell the authorities that he's a kulak and get him in trouble. There was that. But what you said, though, I think the big moral problem was the hoarding, right? Because there were crop failures, there was starvation and actual famine conditions. You had people who were hoarding and didn't want to share it. Just said, I would rather destroy this crop than share it, was the mentality a lot of them had. And
but they were resisting collectivization. Right. They were resisting upgrading and modernizing the system so that it would end famine. And they didn't mind that there was famine because they were known to get fat off famine, was the allegation. And so, and that way it's similar to our current elites, because they're getting, the benefits of this dysfunctional backwards system. And, and so for them, this is the best system ever. You can't.
I think the way I would apply it to the USA is if we have hard times, and I do think there's possibly, actually, it's not even possibly, it's very likely, almost a certainty, actually, that there is going to be austerity, right? And the austerity is either Trump or someone after Trump does, just hardcore austerity measures. We're just going to not spend anything on anything that's not absolutely necessary just to prevent a financial collapse. That's like the good outcome. And the bad outcome is that there is an actual financial collapse in the USA, and then it's just which would be worse. So I think how the kulak situation would apply to us is, are people going to function as a community when it happens, when there's shortages? Like, imagine if there was sugar rations or meat rations, and you had to wait in line for your meat and sugar rations for the week. Would people in the USA even be able to do that? Would you even be able to get the sugar to the ration, to the collection point, without it being stolen or looted off the train, or even just taken by the people who are supposed to hand it out? Right?
I remember during COVID, they had really long lines for food. There was different in different communities. There was food stores or whatever, they would hand out food, and those lines were really long. I remember seeing them. Your question, of course, there's going to be all of that. There's going to be some communities that are going to, behave appropriately, and then there's going to be areas where people, are going to be looting and trying to, use violence to take other people's rations and goods. I mean, that's what's gonna. I agree. Like our future isn't bright in the United States. Things seem to be getting worse, and I think at some point an actual there'll be a precipitous decline, and I think that's when either we attack Iran or Taiwan declares independence. And at that point, the United States is going to initiate a violently enforced embargo against China, and then the global economy will collapse. And I think that's not too far off. But people have accused me of catastrophizing for saying that, and so I'm not certain it's going to happen, but I think it will.
We haven't heard much from Greg.
Greg,
interested to hear what Greg would have to say about all this.
Greg, do you have thoughts? Greg, we're sorry. You have thoughts?
Yeah, it's fine. Thought stages of capitalism should be in the conversation. I mean, the U.S. entered late capitalism, I think, starting, you could say, in the 70s when our wages froze and we began to outsource our industry. And I think neoliberalism also is a term we need to talk about, where as the profits declined, number one, they outsourced industry, downsized, and then began stripping the government and ending all the programs and taking the money for themselves. And I mean, yeah, it's ideal, but they also are aware of growing inequality and how that's chronically a problem. I mean, the liberals and capitalists write about the Gini coefficient and how it's dangerous here. And, I think the planning does happen in imperialism. Like Billy was saying, we're working, you could trace the Ukraine war back to the late 40s or the mid 40s. It started, before World War II ended. And our policy in the Middle East has been the same since the 19-teens, I think. So, and in the domestic stuff, it is quarter to quarter looting, as we can see openly right now. I think the foreign policy is on a very long-term trajectory.
Yeah.
Indi, I think America doesn't have the. So Billy, you were saying like war on Iran or Taiwan. Within the U.S. like war games of Taiwan, they lose within a week, which I think would be generous. They're heavily. You're trying to extend power to someone who's fighting from their own giant country using aircraft carriers, which are as old as me. And it's probably not going to work out super great. And I kind of liken it to like, I think America's, they're trying to like walk across a bar to punch China, fine. But they can't get there because they're getting into 5 other fights on the way over. I mean, like they're running out of like artillery in Ukraine. They ran out of whatever soft power or ability to get anybody into coalitions over Palestine. They can't even get to China. And I think within the military establishment, they're aware of that.
No, I
want to mention the Houthis because there was several. I think it's the Washington Post. I unfortunately can't remember which newspaper in particular.
I think it was the New York Times.
New York Times. Maybe it was New York Times. Yes, it made that printed that article saying that the specific reason for concern and why the USA came to the negotiating table with the Houthis in Yemen was because of the rates they were expending. Munitions.
Yeah, and with these aircraft carriers, they can't just a lot of them they can't reload at sea, so they have to go back sometimes back to Newport News to reload it. So they're throwing these $1 million. I liken it to like we throw rocks at them, and then they throw like Rolexes back at us. Like if we just keep throwing rocks, like they're going to run out of Rolexes faster.
Well, it's interesting though because they cited as $1 billion in munitions, which is honestly low. For the USA not. Big price tag. Yeah. It's really,
but it's not the price tag that's the problem.
It's not the price tag exactly. It's the physical limitation.
Like some of these stuff, like Tomahawk missiles, they're produced in basically bespoke quantities. They're produced in like 12, dozens per year.
They're handmade.
Yeah, they're artisanal missiles.
So let me respond, because I don't want to be the person that exaggerates the power of the United States, because I think the United States lost its conflict with China at least 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, like Putin said. And China's the future. There's forces in process that are unstoppable. And so I definitely don't think that anything that the U.S. can think of doing is actually going to harm China or keep it from ascending. But I will say that the South China Sea is kind of the lifeline for China. They rely on imports. Their current economy, they're very adaptable, and that's why I think China's going to win, because they're adaptable, and I mean there's a million ways that they're going to defeat the West's planning. But that's a lifeline. Their imports and exports is what their current economy relies on. You have missile forces in all these islands in the South China Sea, including the Philippines. And so the United States, at the snap of their fingers, can really start interdicting all that shipping with their missile forces and force China to start island hopping. Force China, hey, you want to stop our embargo of you through the South China Sea? You're going to have to invade the Philippines. You're going to have to go from island to island and root out our very entrenched forces. And I mean, that would be bloody. That would be a mess. That would take months, if not years. So, and I don't think that's going to happen. But this is one example of the thinking in the West, that they think they have this card that they can play. And at the very least, if they don't play it, they can use it as leverage and say, hey, China, you better do this, because if you don't do this, this is what we're going to do, and we can do it. So, but I don't know.
I think that sort of maps to how they think. That's like Greg was saying, that the foreign policy goes on longer timelines. And if you look at the lessons that they learned in terms of foreign policy, they learned from World War II that like this is how we get rich, like that war, like somewhere else, right? Because for everybody else, if you fight a war, it like burns you as well. But if we fight war everywhere else, this is a good way to get rich. So the thinking is still there. So now as the fire dies down, they're like, okay, let's get rich by doing like another world war. That was good last time. I think in the empire brain that idea is very deep. But I don't think they have the staying power for it. It's not the America of the 40s or 50s where they could, churn out even artillery. I don't think America could interdict Chinese shipping with the same way that Yemen has done to Israeli and then American shipping, because they messed around. I don't think they have that staying power. I don't think they have the courage, for one thing, and I don't think they even have the industrial capacity.
In the finances, the U.S. was the creditor in World War I and II. Now we're completely in debt.
And even say that U.S. supply lines, well, like, okay, let's say we cut off Chinese supply lines. Okay, those are cutting your own supply lines. There's some studies that have come, I mean, not even studies, it's from, the guy from, I think Raytheon said we can like de-risk, but we can't decouple from China in terms of their own military supply lines, which are already pretty sclerotic. But there's this joke from an Australian TV show where they're sitting around a table and the guy's like, okay, so we're going to protect our shipping, right? We're going to protect our shipping against by attacking China. Who are we protecting our shipping like with? Oh, it's with China. So it's like how it doesn't.
So
there's this trade wars.
Is it your thought that they're never going to engage in this strategy that they have been planning for, at least planning to to get to the point where they could engage if they wanted to? So because I mean we can't say that they haven't spent decades planning and making this ability something that they could do. But are you suggesting they would never do it, or they might do it and it's just going to fail? Because that's what I'm saying. Like I'm saying they might do it and it's going to fail.
Well, let's take the India-Pakistan thing that just happened. So India tried to hit Pakistan with a pretty big, probably the biggest dogfight in recent history. And they lost 5 jets, I think at least 5. 3 Rafales, which are French, and then I think a Su, like 2 Russian older models. And they lost them to the Chinese J-10, which is, like many generations back. It's like I think the oldest operational Chinese jet, and then they had some AWACS, and then Chinese satellite recon just showing Pakistan where everything was. So Pakistan is, if you're losing to Yemen, which is,
Right.
like you could say it's Iran's sort of farm team, and if you're losing, and if your Western guys are losing to Pakistan, which is again like many tiers down from China, I don't see how you go up against China or even Iran itself.
Right.
If you're losing to, it's like in baseball, if you lose to like, the farm team, you're not going to take on the Yankees.
Well, I would argue like Ukraine is taking on Russia, and that's really the United States, and Ukraine is not being pushed over. I mean, they're losing; they're not going to win. Their defeat is inevitable. But thanks to the United States and the cannon fodder provided by Zelensky, to his everlasting shame, just killing almost probably maybe close to 1 million of his people for nothing. Again, that's what we want to do with Taiwan. That's what we want to do with the Philippines. We want to use.
Taiwan's very different, right? Because Ukraine is still Taiwan's an island. It's very difficult to fight when you have to supply by ship. It's very isolated. Ukraine has land lines. So even China, if you cut off the South China Sea, they have like Arctic routes. They built Belt and Road connections. They have like rail lines. Like they can land, right? So I think in terms of military technology, I don't know if this is what you guys want to talk about, but I think it's the American model, which they learned in World War II, was very aircraft carrier, projecting force very far away, hammer people, right? The model has changed from that fighter jet system to guys with like missiles now are as effective as kamikaze pilots were for the Japanese, or better. So like even $100,000, but definitely $1 million missile is effectively a kamikaze fighter.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That is a good point.
So like with Yemen, they beat America without an air force. They don't have a functional air force. They don't have a navy. So attacking land is not the same as it was in Vietnam, where they had some Soviet jets, but essentially, I mean, Ho Chi Minh said they were fighting with bamboo at the beginning. They obviously got more sophisticated, but it's not the same, right? It's harder to take land. They don't. I think the U.S. has lost air and naval supremacy, which in imperial terms is that's it. Like that's the end of it. If you lose naval and air supremacy and you lose it to Yemen, for example, you're not fighting any other wars.
Yeah.
But I mean, if I'm on record, like Americans can be fucking crazy, so they could definitely nuke us all. But within the military thinking, I was reading this report from some. There was actually like a Jewish group, like Jasper or something, but like it was a military report, and he was saying, all of our guys in the Persian Gulf are now going to get smoked if war breaks out with Iran. We need to like retreat back, and but they can't even retreat back far enough now. Iran's missile technology is better than America's technology. America hasn't invested in missile stuff. It's still based on this, Top Gun fighter jet model.
Right.
But the military paradigm has changed. It's like in military history, you have, the castle versus siege weapons. The evolution goes in bits. But right now, the castles have gotten a lot stronger. So much that, like, dude, Gaza, like, they can't defeat Gaza with the full force of their conscript army there after 2 years, So
yeah,
what the hell's going on?
Netanyahu allegedly this morning said he was going to try one more time. We're going to go all in. They're going all in to Gaza.
Dude, Netanyahu's just trying to keep his ass out of court. Like, that's his.
So no, I appreciate that was a fun disagreement. And I'm not even sure how much we're disagreeing. It's hard to define our various positions, but
I don't think we're disagreeing. I think they want to. I think they definitely want to. And I've read some of the policy documents coming up from since Obama. They've been trying to pivot to China. They want to solve these problems through war. That's their natural response.
Me and Billy Bob have this long-going disagreement on China because I'm of the opinion that it's never going to come to blows, like a military confrontation. It's going to be all political and economic. And we did see this trade feud between Trump and China, which was interesting because they announced they scaled back the tariffs, and both sides kind of declared victory. Trump's team saying, "Oh well, we got China to do what we want," and then the pro-China, I saw the pro-China saying, "Oh well, Trump backed down." So kind of both sides declared victory, and I don't know, and I think it's even too early to say who came out on top. But I did predict at the beginning of this that a trade war between China and the USA is not going to go far. And I actually said Trump and the USA actually kind of have the high ground on that. And I think actually the sanctions against Russia are a good example of that, because the theory was we can collapse the Russian economy by not selling them stuff. And I think the biggest, there were a lot of reasons those sanctions failed, but I think possibly the biggest one was a crucial misunderstanding of who's the stronger party in a trade relationship. Because yes, you can say, "Oh, well, I'm selling you stuff, so I can just not sell you stuff." But if you think about it, outside of a few select sectors, those sectors being like the big ones being food and energy, right? You can't really live without food or energy. But aside from that, most it's just you buy things because you like it, right? I want to have a TV. I want Star Wars themed Funko Pops in my living room, right? You buy things because you like them, but you're not going to die if you don't have them. So if you think about it, it's actually the privileged person in that relationship is the buyer. So Russia didn't collapse from saying we're not going to sell you our Funko Pops anymore, right? So they either found alternative suppliers, those alternative suppliers being companies in Russia itself or in China. But the big thing was, as it turns out, just not selling people stuff isn't really a very useful threat unless it's something important like energy or food. So I think that applies to the U.S.-China relationship, because I saw all these posts like on social media saying, "Oh, the U.S. economy will collapse without Chinese imports." Well, I don't think that's actually true. And I think China does not want to lose that, because the USA is a very big market, has a lot of people. It's like 360 or 370 million people. It's also a premium market. It's true. I think it's true what you said earlier, Indi. We don't have a lot of disposable income, but our money is worth a lot, right? It is worth a lot. So it's a premium market. China doesn't want to lose it. And so I think as far as Trump making demands and getting what he demanded, I think there's a very high chance that's going to happen. And there's not going to be any military conflict.
I think China's definitely... So the Chinese guys have come out and said there's no winners in a trade war. They've constantly tried to de-escalate. They're generally open with everybody. But they have we've seen this happen in Sri Lanka for over 20 years. The Belt and Road, say 2013. But they've been consciously building infrastructure and planning for not necessarily decoupling from the US, but going where the population and resources are, which is not in 10% of the population and whatever percent of the world. So the global South is now a bigger trade component for China than America. I think trade with America is only about 3% of the GDP. I think with the Russia example, you have to ask, what is America trading with them that they need? It's like McDonald's and Netflix, that is stuff which is discretionary and who gives a shit. But China trades, like agricultural equipment, like cars that don't cost $75,000, things like I've seen it happen in Sri Lanka. So when Sri Lankans go abroad, you ask them to bring something, but at some point I told people to I told basically my wife to stop, because she would be going to England or America to bring Chinese stuff. And I'm like, why is that stuff going from China to there and then back here? We could just get it directly from China. And the stuff America gets from China isn't even the good stuff. I think people in America associate China with cheap plastic stuff because that's what they buy. But within China, the stuff is actually quite sophisticated and quite high quality now. It doesn't, like, China wants to trade with America. They've historically want to trade with everybody. But what they've said in their statements quite clearly is it has to be from a position of respect and, you know, equal exchange. And if America wants to shoot itself in the foot by cutting off, even if you want to be an export economy, like, you need imports for constituent for exports. And just in terms of the positioning, so people trade with America and we deal with America just out of because we're used to it, because we consider it stable. So whatever the effect of the tariffs, America no longer looks stable to anybody. So everybody's doing what China had the foresight to do 20 years ago, which is we're de-risking ourselves from America because we can't depend on it. Sri Lanka got hit with some of the highest tariffs for, like, I don't know what reason. But everybody's scrambling to think of, like, how do we adapt away from this? America is not that indispensable nation anymore. I think America could, if they just, forgive my language, if they just fucking chilled, everybody would deal with them for another century and they could have a decent retirement, even though they don't deserve it. But they're not chilling. And so they're going to go down, I think, within this decade. I honestly don't think America will exist past 2030.
I like this. Again, my belief is that the United States has the power to harm the planet on their way down. And what I hear you saying is, you're saying, no, they don't, that they're going to go down and everybody's going to be fine. I'm afraid that on their way down, they're going to be causing a lot of problems, a lot of pain unnecessarily. Is that a fair positioning of a maybe a difference?
Yeah. I mean, I don't I mean, I think there's an interesting debate there, but I mean, I can't say you're wrong. I think there's definitely the ability to harm. I think they could ruin. I think they could destroy the whole planet on the way down. You don't know, like Dr. Strangelove.
So I'm not talking about the use of nuclear weapons. They might use nuclear weapons against Iran. That might happen against Iran's underground nuclear system. They might nuke that. But I think they can collapse the global economy. I think they have enough power to do that. And I think they might try and do that just because they think they're gonna come out of the other side on that in a better position than they are.
So one thing I've noticed about America, like with COVID, I remember when it was going on and Trump did not give a shit until the markets tanked. And even with the tariffs thing, he didn't give it. I'm just saying it's all his personality, but he didn't care until the markets tanked. So that's what really runs America, not what people think or like what they say on TV. Like nobody, that's just like the Roman Colosseum. It's just a show. But so I guess the question there is, can you foresee a situation where America cuts off trade with China and the markets don't tank?
No.
Or can you see a situation where they attack Iran and the markets don't tank? Because that's what they care about. And
particularly the bond market, because we depend on debt so heavily.
And the bond markets have started to move in a weird way, right? So normally, if the markets tank, the bonds market, the bond market gets more attractive. Now the bond rates, the market was tanking, and then the bond rates went up also, which I've seen in Sri Lanka, right? So you guys are in our territory, and I can tell you how that ends up, and it's
yeah, that means no big wars.
Yeah. Right. So I don't think there's any moral thing that would stop America from doing it. I don't even think military logic would stop them. But I do know that in my experience, just watching, whenever the markets start to get shaky, then they change.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what gives me pause. I'm like, Trump talked about peace. Does he really want to be held responsible for collapsing the global economy and the stock market? So these are the two things that I go back and forth about. I
don't think he gives a shit about the global economy, but he wouldn't want to be responsible for crashing the stock market.
Right, but the two are interlinked. Like I don't think you can't destroy China without hurting the stock market. Like the two are interconnected, inextricably linked, and that's the question. But I think there's factions within the ruling establishment that again want to go to war with Iran, and they don't care about the consequences. And I don't know if they hope or if they believe that, the United States will come out of the other side of that, in a better position. But
and I think one thing you can't underestimate is just things getting out of control. Like World War I, you look at it and it's like, oh fuck, a bunch of like stupid decisions and alliances suddenly cascade,
Right.
and then things are out of control, and that's quite possible.
Indi, you've given us an hour. We want to keep you longer. I don't want to end the conversation, but I know that it's late where you are, and so if you need to, just let us know, and we can definitely give you a reprieve. But I'm enjoying the discussion. Greg had something to say before I interrupted him.
Yeah, and Billy, since you've been working this catastrophic theory, I keep pondering history, looking for a parallel. Can we think of one where an empire is end stage and launches a giant war, or somehow successfully pulls itself out of it through mass destruction?
That's a good question. I mean, you could say that USSR collapsing was the opposite, as in they went down quite peacefully. But has anyone ever been able to like murder themselves out of trouble?
No, I mean, not off the top of my head, but I will give that some thought to see if there's a parallel to that. I know it just seems that the U.S. thinks that they came out of World War II in a good position, and then they launched the Cold War that ultimately was effective in neutralizing the Soviet Union. And I think they would like to do something similar. I think they would like to initiate a conflict. They want to get as many countries on their side as possible. They want to form an alliance against China. They want to cause a big thing that's going to hurt China's economy. It's going to be a global economic crisis, and then they're going to have a Cold War against China. And they're gonna have their alliance do an embargo. They're gonna have a long-term Cold War. I think they're trying to redo that model. I don't think it's gonna work. But
no, I mean, I get it, but they went about it all in the wrong order. What you'd want to do is get Russia on your side first. Like, I mean, this has been standard American thinking in the Reagan era. Like Fukuyama, like those guys were evil, but you could read them. They were like cogent, right? And I forget who it was, but someone said, oh, it was that Brzezinski?
Yeah, he was the one that was saying never let our job is to don't let them align.
Yeah, so Russia, China, Iran, divide and conquer. That's the classic thing. So what you wouldn't do is piss the hell out of Russia and then put them on China's side, and then also piss the hell out of Iran and then put them on China's side, because then all of a sudden China has its flanks quite secured, and you're just poking at the South China Sea where you have like one island in the Philippines, which is, to be honest, not that useful. They've kind of gone about it a bit ass backwards. I think because there's all these, they've just gotten used to like all war all the time. They can't just like, pace their wars out. They can't put them in any sort of strategic order. In Princess Bride, the guy says like, it's the standard wisdom is never start a land war in Asia. So they've started 3. I mean, if you include Taiwan, it's not. You should do one at a time, right? Even Napoleon be like, yeah, that's a bit much.
Yeah, and China, of course, is not the Soviet Union. I mean, China's fully industrialized. They're totally integrated in the global economy, and they've made themselves impregnable to economic attack, and they did that on purpose. They did that with foresight. They knew that the West couldn't be trusted, and eventually the West would try to do everything, try and take them down. And so their integration into the global economy really did make themselves impregnable to another 100 years of humiliation and any kind of effort to embargo. Any kind of China embargo was not going to work. And so I mean, the future's good. The only question in my mind, future's very bright, is what can and what will the West do as they continue their precipitous decline? And it's fun to watch. It's fun to watch. It's fun to speculate about. I like your your optimism, and I think there is a lot of reason for optimism. And I think I might be guilty of catastrophizing. I might be a little bit too pessimistic, but I do like to be told that I'm wrong. Not that you were doing that, but
catastrophe is a matter of perspective, right?
Exactly.
Like for me, like a catastrophe of America is good.
What else? What else can we discuss? I know there was. I mean, the headlines today was like, yeah. I mean, and like you said, Bibi's trying to keep himself out of prison. He says there's going to be another big invasion. Trump kind of threw Israel under the bus when he negotiated this agreement with Yemen, and Yemen doesn't have to stop interdicting, Israeli shipping. Zelensky is demanding that Putin, come and, have peace before they discuss peace, right? You got to have a ceasefire before you discuss peace. We're going to have a 30-day ceasefire. Any thoughts on that? Anyone? Greg, I heard you say something.
I said the Kellogg position.
Yeah, that seemed to come from Kellogg, was definitely backing the Russia needs to just agree to a 30-day ceasefire without preconditions, and then we're going to discuss the freezing of the conflict so that in the future we'll be stronger. The West will be stronger, and we'll have a chance to. But yeah, Putin's not going to fall for that. Have you want to speak briefly, Ian, about your vacation and what happened on May 9th? Did you enjoy any festivities?
Yeah, so I was in Crimea. That's why I wasn't on the show. I was in Crimea for the last 2 weeks, and so I was on Victory Day on May 9th. I was in the town of Feodosia, which is a town on the coast of Crimea, about 2 hours drive south from Kerch, which is where the Crimean Bridge extends. And so I was there. And so I would say it's, as far as celebrating Victory Day, it can be a bit better to do it in a smaller town like Feodosia, because, you can go to central Moscow. You can get close to the Red Square for the parade, but you're not really going to see anything. I mean, you might see some tanks drive past for 5 minutes, just drive. But it's if you go to a smaller town, it's more, the celebrations are a lot more accessible. So I think for people looking to celebrate something in Russia on May 9th, it's the best to maybe find a place besides Moscow proper to do it, because it's televised and it's live streamed anyway, so you're not going to miss the Moscow parade. You can go and celebrate it elsewhere. So that's my 2 cents on that.
And Crimea really suffered in World War II. I mean,
yes.
I watched Soviet Storm, which is, I mean, it showed like the Nazis came in and they fought every inch, and then guys were like escaping on boats. It was crazier than Dunkirk for me. And then they somehow fought it back.
Yeah. So what's Indi, for viewers who are not sure what Indi is referring to? So Soviet Storm is a documentary. It's a series, a documentary series. I think you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah. With
subtitles. And what Indi is referring to is in Theodosia was the Kerch and Theodosia was the sites of a major amphibious landing. So the Germans and Romanians took much of Crimea in their initial offensive, laid siege to Sevastopol, and there was an amphibious landing, and actually took much of that back. I don't remember the exact dates. Unfortunately, it was near the end of 1941 that happened. And unfortunately, the following year, the Germans did attack again and retook those cities, and they were under occupation for 2 years. So it is actually a pretty amazing story to look into. I think the Black Sea theater in World War II gets very little attention in Western education and Western media, but it's
growing up in America, I didn't learn about the Eastern Front at all. So I would highly recommend watching Soviet Storm I mean, regardless of how you feel about Russia, because just the military history and the stories there are unbelievable. It puts whatever happened in the Western Front to not to shame, but there was crazy stuff happening. Like every episode of that is quite mind blowing. I mean, in Stalingrad, you have the Germans getting so close, and then the Soviets are building tanks and firing them out of the factory, which is how close the Nazis were getting.
Wow.
And like Victory Day it's even just the experience of war. This guy Andrei Martyanov writes about how it's just, for the Russians, it's very different because it was their soil and their blood. Whereas for the Americans, it was something they went far away to do and then collected checks for. And they have a very different understanding of warfare in general.
Well,
And
like
there's a
Trump
comment.
explained, it was the United States that won World War II. And but I think I want to just make this point. You know, the United States was an unearned beneficiary of their position post World War II. They accounted for half the world's economy, 5% of the global population, and this was thanks to the sacrifice of Chinese communists and Soviet communists, because the Chinese beat the Japanese military, the Soviets beat the German military, the US didn't do shit, and they found themselves in a very, very fortunate position, which they have been exploiting and you know, using this position to, you know, benefit themselves and lead a very unjust, you know, global system that, again, they're the primary beneficiary of, to the detriment of so many people in so many countries. They've just done a colossal injustice and, you know, a disservice with the responsibility and power that they were granted thanks to the sacrifice of the communists. I like to make that point whenever I can.
Yeah, and the Soviet Union did good war against Japan and pushed them completely out of China in 1945. And there's this last comment here. I want to mention this. I actually didn't mention this. So it's not a well-known story in Western circles, of course, but in 2006, there was the Sea Breeze NATO exercises. So Sea Breeze is an exercise they do every year. And what was interesting about that year is Ukraine actually invited them to send troops to Crimea and Theodosia and be there for, I don't remember the exact duration, but they were going to be there for basically for weeks for the duration of the exercise. And there were mass protests in Theodosia, and they ended up canceling that portion of the exercise, and those NATO troops just left. They just left Crimea without, because they were going to build. Because there were Seabees and I think Marine engineers. They were going to actually build some things for the Ukrainian military in Theodosia and the surrounding area, but they ended up just leaving without doing anything. So that's.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. That's like having Nazis back in Crimea.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of, and the interesting thing about Crimea too, is I think, because when 2013, 2014 happened, I personally was not paying much attention to what was happening in Russia, what was happening in Ukraine. So I did see references to the Maidan revolution and the civil war in the news. Wasn't really on my mind at the time. But having seen Crimea and, just looking at it in hindsight, it should have been, I'm not sure what people in the Obama White House were thinking, like how they mapped this out, or if they even did at all. I don't know. But it should be very obvious that Crimea was not going to be allowed to end up in NATO hands, because it's been fought over.
You can't blame them for trying, Ian. Don't blame them for trying.
It should have been an expected outcome.
Yeah,
because it's a very Russian identifying population. I mean, if you even look at just the history of how Novorossiya and Crimea were liberated from the Ottoman Empire, The Turks were pushed out, and those areas were settled. It should be very obvious that's going to be a Russian identifying population for the most part. That should be very obvious if you look at the
idea that Putin would allow, would just shit on the memory of 27 million, veterans who died defending Crimea and defending the Soviet Union by letting, NATO have a
Well, it's
Navy
too culturally, because Crimea is it's very strategically important. It's extremely important strategically. It's also very culturally important. I mean, it really is a jewel on the Russian crown. If you look at the Russian Roman eagle with the heads and the three crowns, it is a jewel. Crimea is a jewel in it. Not literally, but it is figuratively a jewel in it.
Yeah.
And it should have been very obvious that Russia was obligated to do something. I mean, no matter how popular Putin was in 2013, it wouldn't have been politically survivable for him to allow Crimea to be lost. So
even if he wasn't a good guy with good morals, he would have had to do something just because he's a politician. I get it. Indi, you had a thought, I think, about 3 minutes back, maybe not.
Yeah, you were talking about World War II, and so one of my theories is that World War II didn't end. That the Cold War is just World War II for colored people and Slavs who, in true Hitler fashion, they didn't care about. That that America took over the imperial empires from England and France. They assimilated the Nazis into NATO and so on. And they continued Hitler's really core mission, which was killing commies and Untermenschen, sub races. But they don't call that a world war, even though it's happening in Korea, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, across South America, i.e. across the world. They don't call it a world war because it affected colored people and Slavs, but it was war across the world. And I think it really hasn't stopped. But for some reason, I think things are only called a world war when they affect Europe, which isn't even a real continent. But the wars did continue. And they continued as Hitler would have wanted, which is fighting commies. I mean, even in Sri Lanka, we had, they killed probably about 100,000 people for being leftist. Indonesia, they killed lots. So there were liberation movements all over the world, which America went and crushed with either war or coups and corruption, and which I think historically you can just view as a continuation of World War II, just outside of the European theater.
Yeah, I like that.
Absolutely correct. And I, in your writings, you expound on, this perspective, and it's absolutely true, absolutely correct, and it's enlightening. It's enlightening, and so I appreciate hearing it. This viewer was complaining that we weren't talking about Africa and Traore, and of course that kind of is a segue from what you just said, Indi, because we did kill, and Nkrumah, I think, Sankara, and then in the 50s we got that one guy in
Lumumba in
Lumumba. Yeah. So it has been hot war on the developing world, and that never ended. Central and South America. And again, it's just such an abomination. But you're right, because it didn't happen, in the white areas of the planet. We didn't really we didn't call it a world war, and we didn't give it any of the coverage. A real war would get coverage.
I mean, I think in 50 years, God willing, when this is all rewritten, I think a lot of the words and the terms will change. That's why I make up words. I mean, I don't know, because the words themselves trap you in certain ways of thinking. And the victors write the history. But now as they're losing, I think the words are coming unmoored. What did democracy mean? What did human rights mean? What is the rules-based order? What did any of the stuff mean? What was World War II? Did it end? What was history? Did that stop? You have to start questioning all those sort of fundamental things.
Absolutely. And I recommend everybody, follow Indi's writings, because, for the show, I read the most recent 5, and they were all really good. I remember one of them was about the Harmony operating system. It's it's just how tremendous and what a great thing that is for humanity, and how necessary it was, and how it was thanks to the West, the United States, and their embargo that was able to happen. But what else? What else could we harp on? Yes, sir.
Who, sir?
Well, you, Indi, because you pointed it.
Right. No. So one of your commenters, Peter Goodgame, was talking about Traore. I'm amazed that guy is alive. Like, God bless him. But
I know, and I'm worried about him.
Yeah,
I'm worried, but I hope he is. He surrounds himself with the security that he needs, because for sure, that's the kind of person that the West really wants to, silence and get out of the way and make an example of.
I think he went to Russia for Victory Day. I think basically with like fighter jet escort, and then now I think BBC is trying to stir something up about him like killing civilians or whatever. I think it was Al Qaeda or whatever they're using to stir shit up there. But he's trying to be independent in that region. And look, for us in the South, like, so this is weird, but like a fair amount of people here like supported like in India in the independence movement, some people supported Hitler because Hitler was destroying England, right, which was our proximate enemy, and like we didn't really know what people were doing there. We just knew that he was hitting like our enemy. I'm not saying Hitler would have been nice to Indians either, but Churchill, it's hard to be worse than Churchill, right? And it's weird seeing Churchill lionized in the West for everything he did here. But this like inter-imperial fighting gives room for liberation movements. And liberation movements, like, they weren't complete. If you weren't able, so socialism was the way out of capitalism, which is colonialism rebranded. That's one thing I say. Like, and those revolutions were incomplete. If you look at India now today, the reason it's kind of a failed state is because they just took the British systems and even the British attitudes, and they never developed independently the way that China was able to, using Marxist-Leninism as a way to, adapt it with Chinese characteristics. You could say that Islam also is another functioning governing philosophy, but you need some sort of governing philosophy. What I say is that liberal democracy was a Trojan horse, and what do they say? Beware Greeks bearing gifts. Like, we took that in, and then we ended up sucked into the same system that we thought we'd escaped from. So you do need some, and you were talking earlier about, like, what you're talking about earlier is really class struggle. So as long as there's some class, say within America, that profits from this, it'll keep going, even if it immiserates a lot of people. And in India, wealth inequality is at the same level as it was during colonialism, because it does benefit that class. Some people in India live really well and they're really rich. But unless you have some sort of revolution to change class relations, to like put, you have to put your finger, like, so Traore is not elected per se, because it's not clear that he would even come through a democratic system. Because democratic systems, if you read Aristotle, they're slave systems usually. And Aristotle was quite clear and agnostic about this. He said, people just choose. If it's aristocracy, you structure your government that way. If you want to preserve like your slave system, you structure it that way. It's just a way of managing whatever you want to do, you meaning the powerful non-slaves in the society. But you do need someone to come in and put a thumb on the scales. And you guys were talking about earlier, how does America get out of it? A, I don't care. But B, like, you'd need someone to come in and put the thumb, like, your current systems won't do it. Your current systems are designed, the American Revolution was for property. It was for men of property. Everything in America is designed to preserve property rights, not human rights, not like First Amendment, like all that shit is, it's property. So unless you upend that system and take property and, maybe step on some necks, it's not going to move.
And you're not optimistic about our viability, Indi?
Oh, God.
United States?
I mean, optimistic. I mean, that would make me depressed about everybody else's situation. And you got to understand, it's like two sides of the, like, if your situation improves, our situation gets worse.
So you are optimistic about our lack of viability.
I mean, look, I look at Americans and I see that a lot of them can like fix up their house. They're capable of growing food. Like, I hope you guys are able to eat. But the idea that your village idiot from Connecticut or Tennessee should have anything to do with my life or anything to do with the Palestinians' life, that's crazy. Like, we wouldn't send our guy from Cornegala to tell you like what to do in like Texas, right? It's become sort of normalized. Like, if sometimes I see that guy Fetterman, I'm like, that's your village idiot. Like, why is he talking about like something like 10,000 miles away? Like, we don't force our village idiots on you. Like, just be a normal country. I don't care what you do, but just like, be a normal country.
You're asking a lot, Indi. You are asking a lot.
I know.
Ultimately, I mean, that's what's going to happen. Ultimately, we're going to not have the ability to cause so many problems, and that'll be a great, that'll be a big benefit for humanity, a big improvement.
I mean, what interests me is like, do you think it'll break up? Like the United States is designed to fracture along state lines. Do you think at some point, because so when the USSR fell, yeah, Ukraine and like Belarus and those guys, they kind of just like voted to fuck off. And at some point, do you see that happening in the US?
Well, so to answer that, I mean, it's complicated. So by the 1980s, there was a disillusionment in communism, because the government kept saying we were on our way, we were on the road on this bright path to real communism, which they still had not achieved by the 1980s. So there was disillusionment. And at the same time, there was also growing nationalism, right? So there was hardcore nationalist movements in all these member states, and also even in the Slavic states themselves, right? There was a hardcore nationalist movement in Russia, in Ukraine, in Belarus. So I would say it's vaguely similar to Western countries giving up their empires in also in the 20th century. It wasn't, of course, the Soviet Union wasn't an empire; they were equal member states, but it was basically Russia feeding the other states. So the nationalists at the time in Russia and the other two Eastern Slavic states themselves is this idea: we're going to do our own thing, and these other non-Slavic states, Armenia, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and so on, can do their own thing. Right, they can shape their own nationalist.
So could you see any proximate like California nationalist movement? Or
well, that's the thing. So it's more complex. There's not really. It's not really the same because there were Native Americans, but they're unfortunately too small in number to there's the reservations. They're not gonna be the next Kazakhstan. They're not gonna have North Dakota succeed and become an Indian state. It's not.
If there was some elites that would benefit from secession, and again, you would have to have a global economic crisis, and you'd have to have material conditions that are very different, a lot more deteriorated than they are today. But if it would benefit a group of elites, they would definitely try and pump that propaganda out, get people to agree and work towards it. I mean that would be a possibility.
The ethnic my point is the ethnic question in the USA is much more complicated than it was in the Soviet Union because there were more than 40 ethnic conflicts after.
So you're saying when push comes to shove, ethnicity matters more, and that becomes a dividing line.
Well, the problem is that you don't have them concentrate because there was ethnic cleansing against Russians in Tajikistan, in Kazakhstan. What would that look like in the USA? It's tough to say.
I think you'd have to manufacture an identity, right? Like,
there are identities, but the problem is they're not. There's not, for example, a California ethnicity. You have.
But then you see in America there is that like sort of blue-red segmentation where people sort of even don't marry across so in Sri Lanka that's unusual. You can have like a lot of different politics within families or
I think it's
friend groups.
manufactured. I think it's manufactured, and it's more ethnic.
But people take it seriously. Like people take it as seriously as we would take, like, I don't know, like religion.
But just it's a recent. I don't know if it's permanent. This extreme
the problem is,
polarization.
what is an American city that is 40% one ethnicity and 60% a different ethnicity? I mean, I think it'd be, honestly, I would think it's going to be a bloodbath. I think that's what would happen. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, if we look at what the Khmer Rouge, if we look at Cambodia, if we look at other ethnic conflicts where, I mean, even with where, especially when one ethnic, even if you look at, like, if you look at some African country or some country in East Asia, and you're like, you guys are the same. No one on the outside can tell them apart. But, in that country, they're like, oh, well, this group is are the elites and they're privileged and we hate them. And then, that's what starts genocides and ethnic cleansing. So I don't know. It's really tough to say because, you have these very large Hispanic groupings of people, especially in the southern states. But I don't see them saying we want to be part of Mexico again. I don't think because, if you want to be in Mexico, you move to Mexico, right? I don't see like those people saying we want to be part of Mexico now. So I don't, and also because we also have a tendency to lump people together, which is not true. Obviously, just because someone is named Pedro or Juan doesn't mean he's from Mexico, right? And a bunch of people from Honduras and Cuba and all these other countries are going to say we want to make Mexico great again.
Yeah, but you could argue that everything up to like Oregon kind of is Mexico,
right? So I don't know what it would look like. I do think if the dollar collapsed. I mean, because like you said, we are a debtor nation. We're a renter nation, meaning most people don't outright own the roofs over their heads. They're either renting or they have a large mortgage on that home. And there's a very large population that's dependent on food stamps, right? Because no one's really, for the most part, no one's really starving in America. Like there's not a famine. There's not, no one's really, for the most part, going hungry. There is malnutrition. There is bad diets. That's different.
Food insecurity.
But imagine if, you have, I don't even know what the number is. If you have 20, 30 million people who need those payments every month just to eat. And then it's like, hey, guess what? The dollar is worthless. It's like a Soviet or 1990s style collapse. I don't know what's going to happen when you have. I don't think it would be good. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I would say the breaking up of the United States is possible. It depends on how the material conditions change and what the interests are of the elite given those changes. And I unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we're close to having the consciousness necessary for a good revolution. If anything, you're going to have a kind of a bourgeois revolution where part of the bourgeoisie is, wants to do things a little bit different. And Trump, to some extent, actually represented that, because he definitely, I think there is a little bit of a divide within the ruling establishment about how to proceed. And I think we're seeing that play out. That's another dynamic that we have with Trump. But yeah,
I actually have a hard time seeing that any kind of civil war. What is the division in the ruling class exactly?
Oh, you're. It sounds like you might disagree with me, and you're wanting me to entrap myself by saying more, which I'm happy to. I mean, no, it's this approach where it's the globalists versus the nationalists. So that's kind of a. There's one approach where we're going to utilize our allies in Europe and Australia and Japan and South Korea. Together, we're going to have this united front against these intransigent evil countries like China, Russia, Iran. And then you have Trump thinking, no. We're going to change all that. We're going to see everybody as a rival, and we're going to do our best to take advantage of everybody and make sure everybody. I don't know. I think there's.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a difference.
Okay. I mean,
because Biden was waging quiet war on Europe too, and Japan. There's inter-imperialist war going on since, Ukraine started, or you could say before that.
No, okay. I think that's fair. I think, at the most or the least, we could say there was definitely how they described it, right? How they sold their policies and how they sold their leadership was different. And so Trump definitely gave lip service opposing globalism and for nationalism. But I'm not prepared right now to enter into a big discussion about what real differences are. I think that's fun to explore, and I definitely have opinions and thoughts. But at the least, we could say that they were selling maybe the same thing in different ways. But as far as the same thing, I'm not quite prepared to agree that it was the same thing. But I'm not. Indi, any thoughts?
Well, first you'd have to excuse me. My battery's on 8%. No, I'm curious. Because I look at them like, are those different groups, right? Are Biden's elites different? But then they're like, well, no, like J.D. Vance, whatever, still went to like Harvard or Yale or whatever, still married like an Indian. Like, what is the difference really between him and a globalist? Like, it's kind of almost what they say, but then they almost behave the kind of same way. And they seem to like interbreed and like marry I don't know.
Well, let's meet up and discuss it. Let's meet up and discuss it again. Yeah. Go ahead, Ian.
All right. Well, it's a whole different tangent, so let's save it for the next one.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, cool. But you guys have to excuse me. My battery's dying.
Yeah. Thank you, Indi. Hopefully you'll be back again and we can discuss further. There's a lot of things going on. I enjoyed the discussion, but we will wrap it up. So we'll reconvene on Friday, and then Indi, hope to see you soon. Greg, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ian, I'm glad you're off of vacation. Okay, bye guys.
See you guys.
Bye guys.
Bye-bye.